The desert wind carried the scent of dust and dying sage across the Collins ranch as Margaret pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. 3 months had passed since Thomas's funeral, and the silence had become her cruelest companion. The ranch that once echoed with her husband's laughter and the sound of cattle now stood eerily quiet, save for the occasional creak of weathered wood and the distant cry of her 6-month-old son, Samuel. Margaret stood on the porch of their modest adobe house, watching the sun paint the Arizona sky in shades of amber and crimson. The drought had been merciless this year. The few remaining cattle huddled near the nearly dry well, their ribs showing through patchy hide. Thomas had always said the land would provide, but Thomas wasn't here to see how wrong he'd been. "Mrs. Collins?" The voice startled her from her thoughts. Jacob Müller, their elderly German neighbor, approached on horseback, his weathered face creased with concern. He'd been checking on her weekly since Thomas's death, a kindness that both comforted and reminded her of her vulnerability. "Good evening, Jacob," Margaret replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "The baby, he is well." Jacob dismounted slowly, his arthritic joints protesting. At 72, he was one of the few original settlers still working his land. "Samuel's fine, growing strong." She paused, studying the worry lines deepening around Jacob's pale blue eyes. "What brings you out so late?" Jacob removed his worn hat, running gnarled fingers through his thinning grey hair. "There have been sightings. Men on horseback, watching the ranches from the hills. Mrs. Henderson in town, she says they might be part of the Garrett gang." Margaret's blood turned cold. The Garrett gang, the same outlaws who had killed Thomas during a cattle raid 3 months ago. She instinctively moved closer to the door, where Thomas's rifle hung loaded above the frame. "They wouldn't come back here," she whispered, more to convince herself than Jacob. "There's nothing left to take." "Perhaps not." Jacob's voice was gentle but firm. "But a woman alone, they might think you know where Thomas hid things, money, gold, supplies." Margaret almost laughed bitterly. If Thomas had hidden anything of value, she certainly hadn't found it. The small savings they'd accumulated was nearly gone, spent on baby supplies and the few provisions she could afford from town. As if summoned by the mention of his name, Samuel's cries drifted from inside the house. The sound was different tonight, more urgent, almost frantic. Margaret excused herself and hurried inside. The single room that served as their bedroom was cast in shadows, lit only by the flickering flame of a single candle. Samuel lay in his wooden crib, his tiny fists clenched, his face red with exertion. But as Margaret approached, something made her pause. The baby wasn't looking at her. His eyes were fixed on the window that faced the old barn. "Shh, my sweet boy," Margaret whispered, lifting Samuel into her arms. His crying subsided momentarily, but his gaze remained fixed on that window. Following his line of sight, Margaret peered into the darkness beyond the glass. The barn stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky, its doors slightly ajar, something that struck her as odd. She always kept them secured against the wind and any wild animals that might seek shelter. Had Jacob left them open during one of his visits? Samuel's crying resumed, more insistent now, and Margaret noticed something that made her heart skip. The baby's cries seemed to intensify whenever she moved away from the window, as if he was trying to direct her attention toward the barn. "What is it, little one?" she murmured, rocking him gently. "What do you see that I don't?" Thunder rumbled in the distance, the first promise of rain in weeks. Margaret felt a strange pull, an inexplicable urge to investigate the barn. But night was falling fast, and Jacob's warnings about the Garrett gang echoed in her mind. Still, something about Samuel's behavior unsettled her. In her months of motherhood, she'd learned to trust her instincts about her child's needs. After Jacob departed with promises to check on her again soon, Margaret spent a restless evening trying to soothe Samuel. Every time she managed to calm him, his attention would return to that window, and the crying would begin anew. By midnight, Exhaustion weighed heavily on her shoulders, but sleep remained elusive. The approaching storm brought with it an oppressive humidity that made the small house feel stifling. Margaret stepped onto the porch, Samuel still in her arms, hoping the desert air might calm them both. Lightning flickered in the distance, illuminating the landscape in brief, stark flashes. During one of those flashes, Margaret saw something that made her breath catch. For just a moment, she could have sworn she saw a figure near the barn, tall, motionless, watching the house. But when the darkness returned, she couldn't be sure if it had been real or merely a trick of shadows and exhaustion. Samuel's crying grew more frantic, his small body trembling. Margaret tried everything, feeding him, changing him, singing the lullabies Thomas used to hum, but nothing worked. The baby's distress seemed to mirror her own growing anxiety. As the first drops of rain began to fall, a new sound reached her ears over Samuel's cries, a faint, rhythmic creaking coming from the direction of the barn. It was the sound of old hinges moving in the wind, but there was something deliberate about it, almost like a signal. Margaret's practical mind told her to stay inside, to wait until morning, to send word to Jacob for help. But Samuel's increasingly desperate cries and her own maternal instincts were stronger than her fear. If there was something in that barn, whether danger or salvation, she needed to know. She gathered her courage, checked Thomas's rifle, and made a decision that would change everything. Tomorrow, she would investigate the barn. Tonight, she would keep watch from the window, Samuel in her arms, as the storm gathered strength above them, and secrets stirred in the darkness beyond. The rain began to fall in earnest, drumming against the roof like impatient fingers, while mother and child waited for dawn to reveal what the night had hidden. Dawn broke grey and reluctant over the Collins ranch, the storm having passed in the early morning hours. Margaret had managed only brief moments of sleep, her vigil at the window interrupted repeatedly by Samuel's restless stirring. Now, with pale sunlight filtering through the clouds, she could clearly see the barn doors hanging wide open, swaying gently in the morning breeze. Margaret dressed quickly in her practical brown wool dress and sturdy boots, the same outfit she'd worn countless times to help Thomas with ranch work. She checked Thomas's Colt revolver, a skill he'd insisted she learn after their first encounter with cattle rustlers 2 years ago. 6 bullets. She prayed it would be enough for whatever awaited her. Wrapping Samuel snugly in his blanket, she stepped outside. The air smelled of rain-soaked earth and sage, a scent that usually brought her comfort, but today felt ominous. Her boots squelched in the mud as she approached the barn, every step deliberate and cautious. "Hello," she called out, her voice carrying across the empty yard. "Is someone there?" Only the wind answered, whistling through the gaps in the barn's weathered planks. Samuel had finally quieted, his dark eyes alert and focused on their destination. It unnerved Margaret how calm he'd become the moment they'd started toward the barn, as if this was exactly where he'd wanted her to go. The barn doors creaked as she pushed them wider. Sunlight streamed through the opening, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The familiar smells hit her, hay, old leather, and something else, something metallic and sharp that she couldn't immediately identify. "Thomas always said this place held secrets," she whispered to Samuel, more for her own comfort than his understanding. She stepped inside, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dimmer light. The barn looked much as it always had. Thomas's tools hanging on the walls, the old wagon in the corner, bales of hay stacked against the far wall. But something was different. In the center of the space, the hay-covered floor showed signs of recent disturbance. Margaret moved closer, her heart pounding. Someone had definitely been here. Boot prints in the dirt, barely visible but fresh from the rain that had leaked through the roof. And there, near the disturbed area, something that made her breath catch. A small piece of fabric, deep blue cotton, snagged on a splinter of wood. She recognized that fabric. It was from Thomas's work shirt, the one he'd been wearing the day he died. "What were you trying to tell me, my love?" she whispered, kneeling to examine the area more closely. As she brushed away loose hay, her fingers encountered something unexpected, a section of floorboard that seemed loose. She pressed against it, and it shifted slightly, revealing that it wasn't nailed down like the others. With effort, she managed to pry it up, revealing a hollow space beneath. Inside the hidden compartment lay a small wooden box, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. Margaret's hands trembled as she lifted it out. The box was heavier than expected, and when she opened it, her gasp echoed through the empty barn. Gold coins, more than she'd ever seen at one time, gleaming dully in the filtered sunlight. But beneath the coins was something that made her heart race. A letter in Thomas's handwriting, dated just 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Margaret, if you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass. The gold you found is not stolen, though the Garrett gang believes it is. I discovered their cache hidden near Willow Creek after their last raid, but I never intended to keep it. I planned to return it to the families they robbed, but I needed time to do it safely. I've been watching the gang, learning their patterns. They know someone took their gold, and they've been searching every ranch in the territory. I couldn't risk them finding it here with you and Samuel so vulnerable. But if something happens to me, this gold could ensure your survival. There's more you need to know. Jacob Müller is not who he seems to be. His real name is Jacob Garrett. He's the gang leader's uncle, feeding them information about which ranches to hit and when. He's been watching you, waiting for you to lead him to this gold. Trust no one but Sheriff Williams in Tucson. Show him this letter. He's the only lawman not in the gang's pocket. All my love. Thomas P.S. Samuel has always been drawn to this barn. Children sense things we adults miss. Trust his instincts." Margaret's mind reeled as she absorbed the implications. Jacob, who had been so kind, so helpful since Thomas's death, he was one of them. He'd been playing the role of concerned neighbor while actually gathering intelligence for the very men who had killed her husband. Samuel began to fuss again, his cries urgent and demanding. Margaret looked down at her son, remembering Thomas's words about trusting the baby's instincts. If Samuel had been trying to lead her here, perhaps he was now trying to warn her of something else. She heard it then, the sound of approaching hoofbeats, multiple horses, moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. Margaret's blood turned to ice as she recognized the deliberate gait. This wasn't a casual visit. Through a gap in the barn wall, she could see riders approaching. 5 men, all armed, led by a figure she now recognized with horrible clarity. Jacob Müller rode at the front, but gone was the kindly demeanor he'd shown her. His face was hard, his eyes cold and calculating. Margaret quickly rewrapped the gold and Thomas's letter, stuffing the box back into its hiding place and replacing the loose floorboard. She had to think fast. If they found her in the barn, they'd know she'd discovered something. Her only chance was to pretend she'd come out here for some other reason. She grabbed an old bridle from the wall and quickly scattered some hay, as if she'd been tending to imaginary livestock. Samuel's cries would provide the perfect excuse for her presence outside the house. The hoofbeats grew closer. Through the barn doors, she could see the riders spreading out to surround the property. There was no escape route that wouldn't expose her to their line of sight. "Mrs. Collins!" Jacob's voice carried across the yard. But now she could hear the deception in it, the false concern masking something darker. "Are you all right?" "I heard the baby crying from the road." Margaret took a deep breath, steeling herself for the performance of her life. Samuel's safety, and her own, depended on convincing these men that she was nothing more than a grieving widow who knew nothing about hidden gold. She stepped out of the barn, Samuel in her arms, doing her best to look surprised by their arrival. "Jacob, I didn't expect to see you so early." She forced her voice to remain steady, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Samuel woke me before dawn, and I thought some fresh air might calm him." Jacob dismounted, and Margaret noticed details she'd missed before. The quality of his boots, too fine for a struggling rancher, the colt at his hip, well-maintained and ready for use, the way his eyes constantly scanned the property, searching. "These are my nephews," Jacob said, gesturing to the other riders. "They're helping me check on the outlying ranches. We've had reports of suspicious activity in the area." Margaret recognized the irony. The very men causing the suspicious activity were now claiming to investigate it. But she nodded as if grateful for their concern. "I haven't seen anything unusual," she lied smoothly. "Just trying to keep Samuel fed and the ranch from falling apart completely." One of the younger men, his face scarred and his eyes cruel, spoke up. "Mind if we take a look around, ma'am? Make sure everything's secure?" This was the moment of truth. If she refused, they'd become suspicious. If she agreed, they might find evidence of her discovery. "Of course," Margaret replied, praying her voice didn't betray her fear. "Though I'm afraid there's not much to see." Thomas never was one for keeping extensive records or valuable items around. As the men began to search the property, Margaret realized that the next few hours would determine whether she and Samuel lived to see another sunset. The game had begun, and she was playing for the highest stakes imaginable, their lives and the truth about Thomas's death. Samuel looked up at her with his dark, knowing eyes, and Margaret felt a surge of determination. Her son had led her to the truth. Now it was up to her to use it wisely. The search lasted 2 excruciating hours. Margaret watched from the porch as the men methodically combed through every building, every possible hiding place on the ranch. She forced herself to appear calm, occasionally offering them water or asking innocent questions about their search, all while her heart pounded like a war drum. Jacob's nephews were nothing like their uncle's carefully crafted persona. They were rough men with hard faces and quick tempers, the kind who solved problems with violence first and asked questions later. The youngest, who couldn't have been more than 20, kept staring at Margaret with an intensity that made her skin crawl. "Find anything interesting, boys?" Jacob called out as 2 of them emerged from the house. "Nothing but baby things and women's clothes," replied the scarred man. "No sign of any gold or hiding places." Margaret nearly sagged with relief, but she caught herself. She couldn't afford to show any reaction that might seem suspicious. "I told you," she said, adjusting Samuel in her arms. "Thomas was never one to keep secrets from me. If there had been any money hidden here, I would have known about it." Jacob studied her face intently, and Margaret met his gaze with what she hoped appeared to be honest confusion. "Of course, Mrs. Collins. We had to be thorough, you understand. These are dangerous times." As the men prepared to leave, the youngest one, who Jacob had introduced as Billy, lingered behind. "Uncle Jacob, maybe we should post someone here, to keep an eye on the widow. Make sure she stays safe." The suggestion sent chills down Margaret's spine. She recognized it for what it was, not protection, but surveillance. They suspected she knew something, even if they couldn't prove it. "That's very kind," Margaret interjected quickly, "but I couldn't impose. I'm managing fine on my own, and I have neighbors who check on me regularly." "Nonsense." Jacob's smile never reached his eyes. "Billy's right. These are unsettled times, and a woman alone with a baby. It's not safe. Billy will camp nearby, just close enough to respond if you need help." It wasn't a suggestion. It was an order, disguised as concern. Margaret realized she was now a prisoner on her own land. After the men departed, leaving Billy to set up camp near the old water tank about 100 yards from the house, Margaret retreated inside to think. Samuel had been remarkably quiet during the search, as if he understood the danger they were in. Now he slept peacefully in his crib, while Margaret paced the small room, her mind racing. She had to get word to Sheriff Williams in Tucson, but with Billy watching her every move, traveling 15 miles to town was impossible. She needed help, but who could she trust? According to Thomas's letter, the gang had lawmen in their pocket. Any move she made had to be carefully planned. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Margaret watched Billy through her window. He'd built a small fire and was cooking something over it, but his attention never strayed far from her house. Occasionally, he would walk the perimeter of the property, always keeping the house in sight. That night, as thunderclouds gathered for another storm, Margaret made her decision. She couldn't wait for the perfect opportunity. Samuel's life depended on getting help soon. She would have to create her own chance. She waited until well past midnight, when Billy's fire had died down to embers, and his movements around the camp had ceased. The approaching storm provided perfect cover. The wind would mask any sounds, and the darkness would hide her movements. Margaret had grown up on a ranch in Kansas before marrying Thomas. She knew how to move quietly, how to use terrain and weather to her advantage. More importantly, she knew every inch of her own property, including a narrow arroyo that ran behind the barn toward the main road. If she could reach it without being seen, she could follow it for nearly a mile before having to expose herself. She bundled Samuel warmly and strapped him to her chest in a carrier Thomas had made from an old cavalry sling. The baby stirred but didn't cry, a small blessing she hoped would continue. She grabbed Thomas's rifle, a small bag of supplies, and the precious letter, wrapping it in oilcloth and hiding it in her bodice. The back window of the bedroom opened silently. Thomas had oiled all the hinges just weeks before his death. Margaret slipped through and dropped to the ground, landing softly in the mud from the previous night's rain. Lightning flickered overhead as she began the dangerous journey toward the arroyo. Every shadow could hide danger. Every sound might alert Billy to her escape. But Samuel remained quiet, and Margaret's years of ranch life served her well as she navigated the treacherous terrain. She was within 50 feet of the arroyo when disaster struck. A loose stone, dislodged by the rain, rolled down the slope ahead of her. The sound was small, but in the tense silence, it might as well have been a gunshot. "Who's there?" Billy's voice cut through the night, alert and suspicious. Margaret froze, pressing herself against a large boulder. Through the darkness, she could see Billy's silhouette moving away from his camp, a rifle in his hands. He was scanning the area systematically, and it was only a matter of time before he spotted her. Samuel chose that moment to whimper, a soft sound that to Margaret's terrified ears seemed to echo across the entire desert. She pressed her hand gently over his mouth, whispering the quietest of lullabies, praying he would settle. Billy was getting closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. Margaret could hear him muttering under his breath, cursing the wind and the darkness. She had perhaps 30 seconds before he would be close enough to see her, even in the poor light. Then salvation came from an unexpected source. A coyote, startled by Billy's approach, burst from cover about 20 yards to Margaret's left, racing across the open ground toward the hills. Billy's rifle swung toward the movement, and he fired twice into the darkness. "Damn varmints," he growled, lowering his weapon. "Probably what I heard." He stood still for several more minutes, listening, but the storm was building intensity, and the wind was picking up. Finally, apparently satisfied that the disturbance had been caused by wildlife, he returned to his camp. Margaret waited until she was certain he had settled before moving again. This time, she reached the arroyo without incident, and began the arduous journey toward the main road. The narrow wash was treacherous in the darkness, filled with loose rocks and hidden obstacles, but it provided complete concealment from anyone watching the ranch. An hour later, exhausted and soaked by the intermittent rain, Margaret emerged from the arroyo near the crossroads where the ranch road met the main route to Tucson. She had hoped to encounter a late traveler or perhaps a freight wagon, but the road was empty. Dawn was still hours away, and she faced the daunting prospect of walking 15 miles to town with Samuel in her arms. But as she stood in the road, uncertain of her next move, she heard something that filled her with hope, the sound of hoofbeats approaching from the direction of town. As the rider drew closer, she could see it was a single horseman, traveling at a steady pace. Margaret stepped into the road, waving her arms. "Please, help us!" The rider slowed, then stopped. In the dim light, Margaret could see he was a middle-aged man wearing a badge, a deputy sheriff by the look of his uniform. "Ma'am, what are you doing out here at this hour?" His voice was concerned but wary. "I'm Margaret Collins." My husband was killed 3 months ago, and I've discovered something terrible. I need to get to Sheriff Williams in Tucson immediately." The deputy dismounted, studying her rain-soaked appearance and the baby in her arms. "I'm Deputy Carson. What kind of trouble are you in, Mrs. Collins?" Margaret made a quick decision. She had to trust someone, and a lawman seemed like her best option. She pulled Thomas's letter from her bodice, its oilcloth wrapping having protected it from the rain. "My husband discovered that Jacob Mueller is actually Jacob Garrett, uncle to the gang leader who killed Thomas. This letter explains everything. The gang is looking for gold they think I have, and they've left a man watching my ranch." Deputy Carson read the letter by the light of a small lantern from his saddlebags. His expression grew increasingly grim as he absorbed Thomas's words. "This is serious, Mrs. Collins, very serious. We've been trying to get evidence against the Garrett gang for 2 years. If what your husband wrote is true—" "It is true," Margaret said firmly. "I've seen the gold myself. It's hidden in my barn, exactly where Thomas said it would be." Carson looked up from the letter, his decision made. "I'll take you to Sheriff Williams immediately. He'll want to hear this story firsthand and organize a response." As Margaret climbed onto Carson's horse, Samuel finally secure in her arms, she felt the first glimmer of hope she'd experienced since Thomas's death. The truth was finally coming to light, but she knew the danger was far from over. The Garrett gang wouldn't give up easily, and they still believed she was the key to recovering their stolen gold. The race to Tucson began as the storm broke in earnest overhead, lightning illuminating their desperate flight toward justice and redemption. Sheriff Williams was a tall, weathered man in his 50s, with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much violence in his 25 years of law enforcement. He listened to Margaret's story in his office while dawn broke over Tucson, his expression growing darker with each detail she revealed. "I've suspected Jacob Mueller for months," Williams admitted after reading Thomas's letter for the second time. "But suspicion isn't evidence, and he's been clever about maintaining his cover. This changes everything." Deputy Carson, who had waited while Margaret told her story, leaned forward in his chair. "How do you want to handle this, Sheriff? The gang doesn't know she's escaped yet, but they will soon." Williams studied Margaret carefully. "Mrs. Collins, I won't lie to you. What you've done took incredible courage, but it's also put you in grave danger. The Garrett gang has killed 12 people in the past 2 years, and they won't hesitate to kill you and your son if they think it will protect them." Margaret held Samuel closer, feeling the weight of her decision. "What choice do I have? They already suspect I know something. Eventually they would have tortured it out of me, or—" She couldn't finish the thought. "You did the right thing," Williams assured her. "Now we need to act fast. Carson, I want you to ride to Fort Lowell and request military assistance. Tell Colonel Martinez we have a confirmed location on the Garrett gang and need at least 20 soldiers." "What about me?" Margaret asked. "I can't hide here while you go after them. They'll just disappear again, and Samuel and I will never be safe." Williams nodded grimly. "You're right. They need to believe everything is normal until we're in position. That means you have to go back." The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. "Go back, but they'll suspect something if you don't return before Billy reports to his uncle," Williams explained. "But you won't be alone. I'll have men positioned around your ranch before you get there. When Jacob comes, and he will come when Billy reports your absence, we'll be ready for him." The plan was dangerous, but Margaret could see the logic in it. The gang had been operating for years because they were careful and suspicious. Any deviation from normal patterns would send them running, and this might be the only chance to catch them all together. 2 hours later, Margaret found herself riding back toward her ranch with Deputy Carson and 2 other lawmen. They would position themselves in hiding places around the property, while Margaret would return home and act as if nothing had happened. The cover story was simple. Samuel had been sick, and she had walked to a neighbor's house for help, losing track of time. As they approached the ranch, Margaret's heart pounded. Smoke still rose from Billy's camp, but she couldn't see him moving around. Either he was still asleep, or he had already discovered her absence and was waiting to confront her. "Remember," Carson whispered as they prepared to separate, "act natural. We'll be watching every moment." Margaret approached her house openly, making no attempt to hide her return. She had almost reached the porch when Billy emerged from behind the building, his rifle trained on her. "Where the hell have you been?" His young face was twisted with anger and suspicion. "I checked the house an hour ago. You weren't there." "Samuel was sick," Margaret replied, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I was frightened, so I walked to the Henderson place for help. Mrs. Henderson gave me some medicine for his fever." Billy's eyes narrowed. "The Henderson place is 5 miles from here. You walked 10 miles in the dark with a sick baby?" "A mother will do anything for her child," Margaret said simply. "You'll understand if you ever have children of your own." For a moment, Billy seemed to accept her explanation. Then his expression hardened again. "Uncle Jacob's going to want to hear about this. You stay right here while I send word to him." Margaret's heart sank. This was happening faster than expected. The lawmen might not have enough time to get into position before Jacob arrived with the full gang. Billy fired 3 shots into the air, obviously a prearranged signal. Within minutes, Margaret could see dust clouds in the distance as riders approached at full gallop. Jacob hadn't been far away. The next hour felt like an eternity. Margaret fed Samuel and tried to maintain her composure, while Billy paced outside her door like a guard dog. She could only hope that Williams's men had seen the signal shots and were preparing for what was coming. Jacob arrived with 4 other men, all heavily armed and clearly agitated. Margaret recognized 2 of them from wanted posters she'd seen in town: Frank Garrett, the gang leader, and his lieutenant, a man called Bloody Pete Morrison. "Mrs. Collins," Jacob's voice had lost all pretense of kindness. "Billy tells me you took an unauthorized trip last night." I explained to Billy Samuel was sick and I needed help. Frank Garrett, a man with cold blue eyes and prematurely white hair, stepped forward. "Funny thing about sick babies, ma'am. They cry. Billy here says he didn't hear any crying last night." Margaret's mind raced. "Samuel cries so much during the day that I've learned to quiet him quickly at night. I didn't want to disturb your nephew's rest." "Show me this medicine Mrs. Henderson gave you," Garrett demanded. Margaret's blood ran cold. There was no medicine, of course. She had no answer for this demand, and she could see the suspicion growing in Garrett's eyes. I used it all. Samuel needed—" "You're lying." Garrett's hand moved to his gun. "Billy, search the house again. This time, tear it apart if you have to." As Billy moved toward the house, Margaret made a desperate decision. "Wait, I'll tell you what you want to know." The men stopped, their attention focused entirely on her. Margaret could feel the weight of their stares, the promise of violence in their posture. "Thomas did find your gold," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He hid it, but he told me where before he died. Now we're getting somewhere." Garrett smiled coldly. "Where is it?" "In the barn, under the loose floorboard in the center of the building." Garrett nodded to 2 of his men. "Go check. If she's lying, we'll know soon enough." As the men headed toward the barn, Margaret prayed that Sheriff Williams and his deputies were in position. This was the moment of truth. Either rescue would come, or she and Samuel would join Thomas in death. The sound of splintering wood echoed across the ranch as the outlaws pried up the floorboard. Margaret heard one of them shout, "It's here! The box is here!" That's when everything went wrong. Instead of the lawmen revealing themselves, Margaret heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats from the hills. But these weren't the sounds of rescue. These were more outlaws, arriving as reinforcements. "Looks like the whole gang's here," Garrett said with satisfaction. "Perfect. Now we can finish this properly." As a dozen more armed men rode into the ranch yard, Margaret realized with growing horror that she had walked into a trap. Somehow, the gang had anticipated the law's response. The supposed rescue had become an ambush, and she was caught in the middle with no way out. Samuel began to cry in her arms, as if sensing the danger that surrounded them. Margaret looked at her son's innocent face and made a silent promise. Whatever happened next, she would find a way to protect him. The final confrontation was about to begin, and the morning sun climbing over the Arizona desert would witness either justice or tragedy on the Collins Ranch. Thunder rumbled in the distance, not from clouds this time, but from the hooves of Sheriff Williams's approaching posse. The stage was set for a battle that would determine not just Margaret's fate, but the future of law and order in the territory. As gunshots suddenly erupted from multiple directions and bullets began flying across the ranch yard, Margaret dove for cover behind the porch steps, clutching Samuel tightly to her chest. The final chapter of her husband's legacy was about to be written in gunpowder and blood. The battle for the Collins Ranch and for justice itself had begun.